Today on Ascend, the Great Books podcast, we have a special episode discussing Grayson Quay's new book, The Transhumanist Temptation, How Technology and Ideology Are Reshaping Humanity and How to Resist. Grayson Quay is excellent. He's a wonderful thinker. He draws from the great books, the entire Western canon. Actually, reading his book is somewhat like being introduced to a whole library. There's citations on every page. I really appreciated his thought process and how he draws from the ancients to handle modern problems. In our conversation today, we'll discuss Dante, teleology, Aristotle, nature and natural law, Plato, Christian spirituality, and the ethics of technology, medical ethics, and much, much more. So join us today for a special episode on the Transhumanist Temptation with Grayson Quay. Welcome to Ascend, the Great Books podcast. My name is Deacon Harrison Garlick. I'm a husband, father of 5, and serve as the Chancellor and General Counsel for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tulsa. I am recording on a beautiful evening here in rural Oklahoma. If you're new to Ascend, we can help you read the great books. We have over 50 episodes to help you or your small group read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we have over 20 episodes on the Greek plays like the Oresteia and Antigone. And we start next week into our studies on Plato, with an introduction and then 2 episodes on the dialogue First Alcibiades, with almost 20 episodes on Plato's dialogues already recorded. So no excuses. You can read the great books with Ascend. Check us out on X, YouTube, Facebook, and Patreon. We appreciate all of our supporters who have access to our written guides that help them through the great books. Visit thegreatbookspodcast.com for our reading schedule and more information. Today we have something fun. I'm looking forward to today. Today, we welcome back to the podcast Mr. Grayson Quay to discuss his new book, The Transhumanist Temptation, How Technology and Ideology Are Reshaping Humanity and How to Resist. Grayson, welcome back.
Good to be back, yeah.
Yeah, you joined us for a wonderful conversation on, what was that, Book 5 of the Iliad?
I think it was the one where, he's trying to fight the gods, right? Is that Diomedes'?
Yeah, Diomedes fights the gods. Mm-hmm. It's wonderful. Yeah, him like being held by Athena and spearing Ares in the gut. It's a wonderful, wonderful book.
I love that. I always love the moment where he stabs Aphrodite in the hand and she just kind of this great comic relief moment of her rushing back up to Olympus.
Yeah, it's a good one. No, I appreciate our conversation with there. I just remember a lot of C.S. Lewis allusions, which you can't ask for much more than Homer and C.S. Lewis together in a single conversation. Before we dive into your book, just give us like a little introduction of who you are.
So I've done a lot of things. I worked in political communications for a while. I was a classical school teacher for a while. I was a journalist for a long time. Right now I'm working as a ghostwriter, so I write op-eds for people who then, have them published under their names. And I'm, but my one big project I've been working on for quite some time is obviously this book. I wrote most of the first draft back in May of last year, so May of 2024, and sort of spent the subsequent 6 or 8 months revising it and getting it into as good of shape as I was able. And now it is here. It's being released on July 15th. So if you would like to go out and buy one, I would very much appreciate it.
It's a wonderful book. I appreciate it. I got to have a little sneak peek, which I very much appreciated. So the book's on transhumanism. So maybe before we kind of dive into what that means and kind of like sketch out some of your preliminary ideas, what inspired you to write the book?
Yeah, so there's a woman who's a journalist. Her name's Catherine D. She goes by Default Friend on Twitter and in some of her writing. But she had this tweet, and I don't have it in front of me. It's kind of been lost to the ages, but it was something along the lines of that the real dichotomy moving forward, the real split in politics and culture, or a major one, is going to be between transhumanists and people who oppose transhumanism. And I just couldn't get that out of my head because I've been a freelance writer sort of continuously to varying degrees since about 2016. Just always as kind of some kind of supplementary source of income. And then as a full-time journalist, I did a lot of opinion writing too. And one thing I was frustrated me about myself as a writer is I felt like I had all these eclectic interests that didn't really cohere around anything. And I saw that tweet and was like, oh, that's the through line. That's sort of the golden thread that runs through all these things that interest me. Like, I'm very interested in bioethical issues like abortion and surrogacy. I'm very interested in technology and AI and sort of media ecology stuff. I'm very interested in religion and in this kind of sort of Eastern mystic reenchantment movement thing that's going on. I'm really interested in post-liberal critiques of liberalism and modern economics, and then I'm all of these things seemed really disparate to me, and suddenly I was like, oh, I think what they all have in common is this idea of transhumanism and opposing it and wanting to preserve that. So transhumanism, the way I define it in the book is I'm not just looking at technological applications, putting a microchip in your brain or altering your genome so you can grow gills or uploading your brain to the cloud so you can live forever. Well, these are all like manifestations of transhumanism. But I think at root, it's an ideology. It's sort of a mindset or a philosophy, which has its roots going back centuries and centuries and centuries. So in the book, I talk about David Hume with the is-ought fallacy that, well, maybe human beings have a nature or something, but that doesn't mean you have to abide by that. Just because you are a certain type of creature, that doesn't tell you anything about how you ought to live, which is a huge departure from Aristotle and the whole classical tradition. And Sartre says roughly the same thing when he says, if you have a pocket knife, its essence precedes its existence. Someone planned out what it was for and made it for a purpose. But you, as a human, as the product of blind forces of the materialistic universe, your existence precedes your essence. You get to, the meaning of your life is to give your life a meaning. You get to make it up. And in fact, you have to. And that's the same thing Nietzsche is saying with the whole God is dead thing. And then in opposition to this, you have what you would call the natural law tradition that stretches from Plato and Aristotle up through, Augustine and Aquinas and the whole Christian Middle Ages, and even forward to some of the, some of the Enlightenment thinkers. Natural law is, in many ways the foundation of the American founding. And we've, totally abandoned this to the point that it's hard for many people to even conceptualize anymore.
Yeah, one thing I really appreciated about your work was how much you pull from the Western canon. It's like every other paragraph you're pulling from like an author of a great text and kind of weaving them together to like build a conversation. It's one of the things that I really enjoyed about your work. It's one of those books that if you read, you're actually introduced to an entire library. And that's this again something I was very grateful for because it made me realize like, man, I need to be more well read. There's a lot of authors I need to be more conversant with to be able to kind of jump into this conversation. But I think you laid them out really well. Kind of, you laid out a lot of things. I think we need to get into those. We need to unpack them. But just as a preliminary, when you wrote this text, like who's your target audience? Like who was on your heart when you were actually trying to explain the problem with transhumanism?
Yeah, so it's being published by Sophia Institute Press, which is a Catholic publisher. So I imagine a lot of the, audience who's kind of buying books from this publisher will be Catholics, but I didn't necessarily write it just for Catholics or even just for Christians. I say in the opening that I'm planning to be explicit about my faith commitments, my Christian faith, because I just don't think there's necessarily a good answer for why we shouldn't become transhuman. If God, I think, if God doesn't exist, everything is permitted, right? As like Dostoevsky said. But I do try to reach out to those people, and I want to give them some sense. I mean, if nothing else, to like scare them a little bit and have them think through, like, no, where are we actually headed? Like, where is technology actually taking us? It's not just your iPhone gets a little bit better every year. Like, there's serious trends in our technology and in our culture as these interact that are already fairly well progressed, and that if they continue to progress will lead us to some very, very frightening places. And I say, like, if you don't have any faith, if you don't believe in God, then the best I can offer you is maybe you should consider sticking with humanity because it's tried and true, because it works, because there's some degree of ancestral wisdom that's been passed down about how to be human, and that if you abandon that, then you sever yourself from all of your ancestors, and anything you pick up over the course of your life will be of no use to your descendants. You'll
Yeah.
be all alone in the dark, just sort of groping around, and it's a really sad and difficult way to live. And I think that in many ways we've already started to do that. Like, it's, if you think about, um, in some ways, I quote Mary Harrington a lot. She's a brilliant journalist. She wrote a book called Feminism Against Progress, but in that she argues that the birth control pill is the first widespread transhumanist technology, and I think she's right about that. Because if you think about, a generation that has access to easy access to an oral contraceptive that's reliable, that's a huge change in how a species reproduces. It's the kind of thing, that's the kind of shift you might see over millions of years of evolution, and it happened in a single generation. Uh, and we had thousands of years of literature and folk wisdom and everything else about human sexuality and how the sexes relate to each other. And much of that was just rendered obsolete overnight by this, or at least that's how people viewed it, and that's how people responded to it. So in many ways, we're already several steps into this transhumanist experiment, into succumbing to this temptation, and I think we're already seeing the poison fruits of it.
Yeah, one thing I really appreciate about your text is that you try and take a step back and look at the overall kind of historical picture. Like, this thing did not develop in a vacuum. It did not pop up in the last 10 years. You make a claim towards the beginning of the book that humanism is actually the first step towards transhumanism. Can you kind of explain that claim a little bit, and how you're trying to show transhumanism, as you mentioned earlier, not just like immediately as a example of technology, but as an ideology that's actually animating a lot of different things in our culture?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I'm throughout the book, I kind of use anti-transhumanist or anti-transhumanism to describe what I'm trying to do, which is a little bit of a clunky term, I admit, but I didn't want to use humanism because I think the well's sort of been poisoned on that term. The American Humanist Association is just atheists. It's an organization for atheists. Kurt Vonnegut was honorary president for a time, which I find interesting. But yeah, humanism tends to mean today just, that man is the measure of all things. This slogan of the sort of extreme wing of the Renaissance. And I acknowledge that there's a long tradition of Christian humanism, which I think is really good. I just think that the way we usually hear and interpret the term humanism is leading us to transhumanism, because once you've set up man as the measure of all things, it ceases to be a stable platform from which to measure. Once you have the technology to remake humanity into what you want it to be.
Said, yeah, I think that the problem with that type of and that species of humanism, right, is that it divorces the human from basically the cosmos, where there's nothing that orders what we mean by human or human nature, and it just becomes very malleable. And so you can see then, and I think this is one of the things that you track really well, is that you show transhumanism as an ideology first, an anthropology. How is it that we actually view man? And then it gets coupled with technology, and now just basically anything we imagine, we can start to actually make real, which is something that prior generations did not. And so it looks like technology is kind of the gasoline on the fire, if you will. That's allowing a lot of these ideologies to actually have some really concrete substantiations in our culture. Earlier in your introduction, though, you talk about teleology, right? You talk about Plato and Aristotle. Can you talk a little bit about, like, for those who aren't familiar, what is teleology and why is it so important when we look at, like, what is nature?
Yeah, so telos is an end, right? Or a goal, a proper, the thing at which something aims, right? So an oak acorn aims at becoming an oak tree. It fulfills its nature when it becomes an oak tree. And Aristotle, I quote a line from Plato's Republic where he says, if you have a good pruning hook is a one that prunes trees well. So what's a good man? Um, there's qualities of a pruning hook that makes it a good pruning hook, whether it's being sharp, being well balanced, being long enough, whatever, to do the job. What makes you a good man? Is that a reasonable question? Sartre would say no, there's such a thing as a good knife, there's not such a thing as a good person. Except one that like embraces his freedom, I guess. And then Aristotle says something similar. He says, like, are we to believe that there's an excellence proper to a shoemaker in making good shoes and not an excellence proper to man as himself? And this actually is very much of a piece with what you see in the Old Testament, where in Proverbs you have wisdom crying aloud on the streets, right? This is shokma. I don't speak Hebrew. Chokma, maybe, perhaps. I have to do the glottal, but
It sounded great.
yeah,
It sounded
yeah.
great. We'll go with it.
But it's the same. If you then go back to Exodus, it's the same word that's used for the craftsmen who are recruited to work on the temple. And they're usually translated differently. In Proverbs, it's translated wisdom, typically in English Bibles, and in Exodus, it's translated skill because they're talking about stone carving and embroidery and things like that. But this is the same word, and that's exactly what Plato and Aristotle are getting at: is that there is an art or a craft to living well, the same way there's an art or a craft to carving a good chair. And I think that has to be your starting point. What do we aim at? And for Aristotle, the answer is eudaimonia, happiness. Sometimes I use flourishing as a translation for that, because I think it sort of evokes what I'm getting at a little bit better. But yeah, and then this gets into the question of like using technology, because when you object to some uses of technology as being unethical or as being transhumanist, sort of the automatic pushback you get is like, you're a Luddite, you don't like technology. And my response is, I love technology. What scares me is that we don't have the proper anthropology to use it responsibly. The proper use to me of just to take medical technology, for example, is to fix what's broken. It's to restore people to the type of flourishing proper to them, to the type of health and flourishing proper to a human. Setting my broken arm, great, thumbs up. Sewing a third arm between my shoulder blades, no, you shouldn't do that.
Right. Yeah, no, very well said. I think you articulated that well. Let me see if I can kind of regurgitate it a little bit. Insofar as that, I think the pruning hook, right, the knife example from Plato's Republic really is kind of the example par excellence, right? So if we understand, because the teleology really is at the heart of this kind of classical understanding of the cosmos, right? So if I understand that the purpose of a knife, the telos of the knife, is to cut, I understand its purpose, right? This artifact actually has a purpose for which it was made. Then I also understand what it means to be a good or bad knife, right? I understand the quality of the thing by its end. So I would understand that the good knife has to be sharp and the bad knife would be dull because its quality is predicated according to its purpose. And so you would say, if you use it in human terms, the virtue of the knife would be the sharp, and the vice, the viciousness, right, would that it would be dull. And you can even start to understand then what's good or bad for the knife. So things that would make it sharp and strong would be good. Things that would make it dull would be bad. And so I love how you transition there, because you see that same teleology and you see the same argument that Plato and Aristotle make is like, okay, then what is the teleology of man? Because like you would say, I would say, oh yeah, I know a good man. Oh yeah, that person over there, that's a good woman. Well, why do you call them good? To know that a thing is good, you have to understand its purpose. Do you understand the purpose of man? And then we have to get into what is the purpose of man. And so I love though what you said and what you talked about, like on a more micro level of medical ethics and technology, because I think this is where you see things really clear. So as you said, like your eye has a certain teleology, like you have a purpose of the eye, and of course you have a purpose of the eye. It has to see, and that purpose gives it a certain structure and order. We can study the eye, we understand its purpose. It has to have a certain order to actually achieve its purpose. And so, yeah, if you go to the doctor, the purpose of medicine is to restore sight. It's actually put you in a state of what is the teleology of the part that's broken, and can we restore it? We want to fix our heart. We want to fix our eye. And we can do these things because it has a teleology and therefore it has an order that can be restored. And I just really want to stress again what you said, because I think this is something that people miss, is that then when you start doing things that are not connected to the teleology of the body, then there's a huge question of is what you're even doing medicine? So it might be done by doctors, it might be done by medical technology or drugs or hormones or whatever. But when you start doing something that's contrary to the teleology of the body, then are you really actually performing medicine anymore?
Yeah, there's an essay I quote in my book by a transgender author named who goes by Andrea Long Chu, who's a biological male who has had surgeries to resemble a woman, and wrote this great essay called my I'll censor it a little, my new genitals won't make me happy. And his argument is, if I go through this this bottom surgery, this vaginoplasty, I'm going to be in worse health. I'm going to have to do a lot of very unpleasant maintenance on this new orifice I've been given. And I may well become mentally less healthy too. There's often cases where people become more suicidal after um, after they have the surgery. And then it just the essay takes this really diabolical turn where he says, but neither of those things are good reasons why I shouldn't be able to do it, because I want it. And my desire and my happiness are totally independent agents of one another. And Spencer Clavin, who was kind enough to write a blurb for my book, I sent him this essay and we were talking about it, and he said to me, "I think that's the definition of hell. Actually, is when your desires are completely divorced from your eudaimonia, from your flourishing, from what is proper to you, from what your purpose is. Um, that's when there's no redemption left for you. That's when you've totally separated yourself from God and from any hope of being what you're made to be."
I agree. Yeah, the mind moves from grammar to logic to rhetoric. Like we have to understand our terms before we can apply them, and then we can actually, talk about them. And so, one of the things that you talk about in your introduction that I think is heavily tied in here is the concept of freedom, of liberty. Do we actually have the proper grammatical understanding of what that word actually means? And what you just described, which is horrific. And, as an aside, that's not medicine. And the butchers that practice that and pull in broken people to perform whatever that is, that butchery, I mean, it's demonic. It really is. And to prey upon people like that, I mean, I don't think our society really grasps the depravity of that. But if you look at the individual themselves and what you articulated there, that misunderstanding of freedom, I mean, it's really a Luciferian understanding of freedom, right? It is that strict autonomy we talked about earlier, that man then is divorced from the entire cosmos. Nothing actually informs him on who he should be. There's no nature, there's no history, there's no God, there's no church, there's no faith. He really is just this completely free in scare quotes creature that's malleable, to his own self creation. And so I think, can we talk about freedom for a second? Because as I've wrestled with this, it seems like on the modern side, when we say freedom, we mean like a plurality of options to satiate my desire. Like the more options I have to do what I want, the more free I am. And if someone impedes on that, then it's tyrannical, right? We all scream about our rights. But that's not how the tradition looks at freedom, right? How does the tradition look at freedom? What should we think of freedom?
Yeah, I think you're right about it being Luciferian. Like, we were talking about this before we started recording, but my original title for the book was The Serpent's Promise. Because I think that, ye shall be as gods in the garden is really the original transhumanist manifesto. Um, but yeah, I think our conception of freedom is really broken. Like, you have you have the famous Supreme Court decision where it's like at the heart of freedom is the ability to sort of choose one's own conception of the mystery of human life, or something like that. Yeah, so freedom, I think the definition I use is being unencumbered in the pursuit of the flourishing proper to yourself, to what you are. And I think that that doesn't need to be frightening, because it doesn't mean that everyone has to follow this same sort of cookie cutter path. Obviously, everyone is different and has different gifts, and to flourish and to be a good person involves, following those and developing those and expressing those in different and unique and beautiful ways. Not every good chair looks the same. Not every good life looks the same. So there's an immense amount of freedom within that. What there isn't freedom to do is choose your own telos. Um, you know,
Right.
a an oak acorn. I think I say in the book, an oak acorn can't just decide it wants to be a blueberry bush.
Right. Yeah, your freedom seems to be then tethered according to your nature,
Mm-hmm.
right? What is the teleology of your nature? What's its purpose? Man's a rational animal. What is the aim of our actual existence? And then our freedom then, right, seems to be oriented towards that. I think one thing that we don't really understand as moderns is that, the ancient concept of freedom is that freedom is actually the capacity to choose what is good. And as you say, there might be a legitimate plurality to what that good is, right? We're called to different types of goods, if you will, not in a relativistic way, but we're called to play out different types of vocations, right? We have different capacities. But this freedom is always then within the bounds of our own human nature. And we're called to actually seek after these goods. And we have an appetite, right? We have this will, we have this freedom to actually seek that good. And I think it's just something that's like really lost on us now, because if you we constantly as a culture talk about freedom all the time, right? I'm not free, or this is now fascist, or this is tyrannical because it stops me from having certain rights. And it's just one of those words, kind of like love, that we've just completely gutted. And it doesn't really mean anything anymore. One thing though, it's already kind of haunted our conversation a little bit, but can you just say a little bit about technology? Why are so many of the discussions around transhumanism always tethered to technology, and why is technology making it, or seemingly making it, so much worse?
Well, because I think that the technology that this anthropology has been awaiting has finally arrived. Like, we finally, sort of for the first time, just in the last several decades, have the tools to take these bold assertions of radical human freedom untethered from any sense of teleology, and to make them a reality. To say, like, okay, let's have the courage of our convictions. If God is dead, if existence precedes essence, if all these things are true, then why shouldn't I why shouldn't I try to change my sex through surgeries and hormones? Why shouldn't I try to enhance my performance um, with cybernetics, or by implanting something into my brain or something like that? It's, there's no more guardrail around. There was no philosophical guardrail already around doing this, and now there's no practical guardrail to prevent it either. And I think this is what C.S. Lewis sort of sensed at the very beginning of the era with the abolition of man, is that humanity can now be treated as a raw material on which the human will can operate, which just reduces everything to whims, because that will no longer has any standard of flourishing it can aim at. It's just what you have the power to do and what you have the will to do. Um, and the way it's often sold with technology is that this is what you can do to yourself. These are all the options for what you can become if you wish to become this thing. It's presented as individual empowerment, but I think what Lewis was onto is that the conquest of man by nature, the conquest of nature by man, I think he says, always ends up to be the conquest of some men by other men. Um, and in this case, he talks about this sort of cast of controllers who have control over this, and it sounds very like shadowy and dystopian and everything. And then you step back and you go, well, okay, we're supposed to like start living a significant portion of our lives in the metaverse or whatever. I don't make the metaverse. I don't, write its laws. I don't design its aesthetics or its physics or its rules, or its community standards or whatever. That's the world of Mark Zuckerberg I'm stepping into, where he is God and he shapes he shapes everything in this way. And if you want to live in this virtual reality, if you want to be a transhuman being who exists more and more in cyberspace and identifies more and more with this avatar instead of this body, um, that's not something you have total agency or control over. And that, you know, and then even with something like transgenderism, like there's a pretty well established social contagion element to this, where people who, where, you know, young kids who are vulnerable to peer pressure and who might have other, you know, mental health challenges are drawn into this because they see influencers or they see classmates. Um, so this is the kind, and then obviously you have this whole industry that's making a large amount of money on this and now has a vested stake in promoting this ideology as something positive and admirable and beautiful and praiseworthy and desirable. So yeah, people are, you know, there may be the illusion of individual choice in many of these cases, but this is something that's going to be foisted on us. And as it becomes, now it's an option, but soon it'll become an expectation that you're able and willing to augment or alter yourself in order to fit um, society's expectations. We'll no longer build societal institutions and things to fit people. We'll cut people to fit those institutions. And if you refuse to do that, you'll find yourself slowly excluded and frozen out of public life more and more and more. And I think that's something we have to prepare for.
Yeah, very well said. Yeah, a few thoughts there. One is, man, Abolition of Man is such an excellent text. It is so good. If someone's listening right now and you haven't read that, it's short. It's by C.S. Lewis. It's excellent. Like it's a coffee shop read, but it's a wonderful mapping of modernity. And to your point, yeah, one of the things that I learned there was that there are no true relativists. People are only relative about the values and virtues that they want to destroy, and then they're absolutists about the ones that they want to implement, right? So when we see these kind of relativist ideologies that pop up, they're always corrosive, typically to traditional ideas, but they're not truly relativist where there's no truth. There's just some truth that they want to replace it with, right? You can usually find out, you can figure out pretty quickly what those are by, what their own blasphemies and sacred things are that they aren't willing to actually, transgress. And I like what you said too, because I want to push into that about technology, because technology is all around us. It's something that's ubiquitous. I don't know if we talk about it enough, but kind of reading your work and listening to tonight, it really seems like at least a preliminary understanding is like what is the moral framework for technology? And it really seems like a teleology rooted in our nature is a good start, right? Does this technology actually help restore my nature or even like perfect it? Or is it contrary to it? And one thing I would ask you that I was kind of contemplating this morning as I was rereading your text is, it's easy maybe to point out to certain transhuman examples, right? And say, we've had several tonight. But in certain ways, do you think that our culture overall is becoming transhuman in ways that maybe like even you or I aren't even really aware of? And my thought process here is that technology seems to always make a claim upon man. So whether it's the Bronze Age and all of a sudden we have bronze swords, like that changes things. It changes warfare. It changes glory. You think of the Iliad, it changes certain things. Like every technological shift that we've had seems to make certain claims upon how like who man is and how he lives in society. And today, I mean, think about the effect that my iPhone has had on my own intellect and my brain and my nature and how I'm addicted to it. And I reach for it, perfunctory without even thinking. Think about how social media has warped things. And so do you think that, because I don't want to just like point fingers at others, which is, it's not what I'm saying you're doing, but I'm kind of critiquing myself here. I don't want to just point fingers at others and say, look at them, they're struggling with this ideology. Man, this seems to be something that's in the water. Like there's this like transhumanism that's just like bubbling to the surface, and every new thing we have, like whether it's Meta, any social media. Now they have goggles that you wear that just like bring up things no matter where you're walking. Like it seems like all of that is making certain claims upon our identity as man and trying to, I guess, use this word, trans us to something else than what we actually are designed to be.
Yeah, I think it's good to be self-reflective, and I try to do that in the book a little bit. Like I think that my phone, you know, it feels many days it feels a lot more like a sort of organ that I happen to carry around in my hand, like a sort of sense organ that helps me perceive, the sort of the sort of virtual world around me. The same way my eyes perceive light and my ears perceive sound waves. And when you leave it somewhere, it's like you've forgotten one of your five senses. There's just a whole sphere of reality you can't tap into. And people become anxious when they don't have their phones, which is such a strange thing when they didn't exist 20 years ago. But yeah, I think that what you said is technology always makes a claim on us, and that's something that I deal with. I don't want to give away too much of my book, but my last section is on religion, and it gets real weird. So I hope everyone who reads it will enjoy it. But one of the things I talk about is I go into some of the Enochic literature, the Book of Enoch, where it sort of zooms in on the kind of pre-flood history from Genesis, with the sons of God and the daughters of men joining in marriage and being giants in the earth and everything like that, and Cain's line building a city, and then it's mentioned that they developed these technologies, whether to make musical instruments or discovering new forms of metalworking and things like that. And the way that that's presented in the Enochic literature is actually that the sons of God and daughters of men are couplings of fallen angels with women. The actual logistics of that are never made entirely clear, but that they produce these these sort of transhuman beings, these kind of superhuman beings, or demigods, you would say in Greek mythology, that are referred to as the Nephilim, and that these people became kind of warlords, and they were sort of advised and visited by these fallen angels who had, in many cases, sired them, who taught them these technologies, like who taught them sort of different forms of divination and weapon making and all these other things that gave them power that they could then wield to dominate and tyrannize other people. One funny little thing in the Book of Enoch is one of the technologies they're given is cosmetics. I think that specifically says like eyeshadow. So there you go. Makeup is demonic technology, but it's sort of it kind of reminds me of that bit in the Iliad where you have the arming scene with Hera, but it's her like putting on makeup to go seduce Zeus, but it's presented as like a putting on armor type scene. That's just sort of her equivalent. Like seduction is sort of the equivalent of domination for men. Anyway, from all this, I just kind of infer that I think there is something that the tradition is warning us of, that the sort of Judeo-Christian tradition is warning us of, which is that these demonic forces do introduce technologies to us to induce us to destroy ourselves. And if you take that reading of kind of the pre-flood narrative, the Enochic details that are added in there, then what God's doing with the flood is basically knocking us back to an earlier level of technological development, is washing away all of those technologies that were given before the flood. And then you have the same thing at the Tower of Babel, where again, they're scattered there. God winds the clock back on technology, and because he sees that humanity is reaching a point at which they'll destroy themselves, each other, the world around them, all the above, take your pick. And I think we're starting to approach a moment like that again.
Yeah, it's very reminiscent of Dante. Like all of a sudden you're going down into the pit of hell, and you've gone past some like very depraved sins that we would obviously think are very heinous, and all of a sudden you run into the alchemists. We're like, really? Like the guys that are trying to turn some other metal into gold, they're way down here in the
Mhm.
eighth circle of hell. And I think one of the things that Dante is getting there is exactly what you said, is that there's a certain point in which technology, with an obsession of being able to control nature, starts to push into the demonic and look to the demonic for the reception of that type of power that it actually craves. This kind of goes back to the relativist example, right? That it's actually a power dynamic. They're not actually truly relativists. They're simply trying to destroy one type of hierarchy and implement another one. And it's amazing how many of these kind of facades crumble into basically different types of power dynamics. Earlier though, you mentioned Nietzsche, and you mentioned kind of his famous like "God is dead" statement. How does that play into this kind of transhumanist conversation?
Yeah, it's sort of it's an attempt it's kind of a challenge thrown in people's faces. Obviously it would be nonsense to say that a literal existing deity has literally passed away. But what he's saying is that the whole concept of teleology no longer makes sense. The idea that there is some inherent meaning or some connection or some thread that runs through the cosmos in this way is not the case. Any moral values you think you hold are all historically conditioned, are all the product of cultural forces. They have no connection to any kind of objective reality. This is, you know, anything that you thought you got from God, whether it was a moral code or a sense of belonging in the universe or a sense of who you are and what your purpose is, none of that is real. So what are you going to wake up and do tomorrow now? And for him, it's this challenge of like, make yourself an Ubermensch, an overman. And then, or, become a last man, become, one of these kind of pathetic creatures who just seeks comfort and doesn't want to be bothered, and doesn't want to think too hard about anything or face up to any challenges. And I think interestingly, you have a kind of transhuman temptation facing both of them. One is, for an Ubermensch, it's how do I make myself into a superhuman or a superman? And then for the other one, it's how do I kind of relieve myself of the burdens of being human as opposed to transcending human limitations. Like, how can I just sort of deaden myself in some way, whether that's by, escaping into a virtual world or by, breaking down the barrier between a human and a machine by making AI your girlfriend or your best friend and just having this relationship where you're constantly affirmed and loved and flattered, and know this you know AI construct you're talking to never pushes back on you or has a bad
Uh-huh.
day or needs you to rub its back when you would rather be doing something else.
Yeah, I was recently at a legal conference, and our ethics portion was actually on AI. And one of the things they pointed out to the bunch of attorneys is that AI is designed to please you. It's designed to be, pleasurable to use. And so it was showing all these things of, where it would tell you that because these are lawyers that are using AI behind the scenes. It's telling them like oh yeah, this is a great argument, or like this is a great case, or whatever, and it's flattering them. But actually, it's not actually a good argument, or the case doesn't even exist that it's given you, right? So no, it brings in like this. Yeah, what ends up happening, right, is that there's like these artificialities that serve as a veneer over what's actually real. And the problem is with technology is that we seem to just simply be stacking them one on top of the other, in which now, like Plato's cave, right, instead of ascending out of the cave, we're digging a hole, right? We're going down, right? We're actually creating more layers of these artificialities that we actually have to navigate out of. And one of the things that I appreciate about the parable of the madman and Nietzsche's conversation about that God is dead, one thing I've always been sensitive there too is that he's trying to explain to all these like pious, Lutherans that they've killed God. And I've always appreciated that because there's also, I think, with this kind of transhumanism, there's like a practical atheism that kicks in, right? So I might believe in God, I might even say I'm Christian, I do all these things, but my actual actions and how I treat my own humanity, really, actually, my actions tell me that there is no God, that I don't believe in a creator, that I actually am the creator of my own life. You go back to Justice Kennedy's famous or infamous statement, right, about the mystery of life and our self creation. And so this is what I'm concerned about, and I think your book draws out really well, is like how this transhumanism is just kind of seeping into the culture as a whole. And we might be able to look at like very distilled examples and say, oh yeah, that's bad. But like technology is making certain transhumanist claims upon us, even just in our daily life. And all this stuff is getting integrated, whether it's in the workspace or just the family, or, for those of us who have kids, I feel like it is a constant battle to keep screens away from my children. They don't have screens at my house. We really push away those. We go to a little classical school that doesn't have screens, and still they're always around. They're begging for attention, begging to kind of rewire your brain. And it just seems to be the culture now that we're just saturated in.
Yeah, well, one thing I say in the book is that I think if you're fighting this battle on your own, if it is just a question of, well, and maybe my immediate nuclear, household family will make decisions about how we're going to use technology, it's a mismatch. It's you and your self-control, and whatever, oversight you're able to exercise over your children, versus the smartest people in the world are recruited to work at these companies making apps. And these apps are designed, I feel like I'm describing the One Ring with one to destroy the world of men, right? These apps are designed to trigger your dopamine receptors to addict you. It's an intentionally addictive product, and so to put one person's if you're talking about like keeping screens away from kids, like letting kids have real embodied childhoods where they run around and play and get some bruises and scrapes, and are embodied human beings, as opposed to these sort of virtual transhumans that where most of the meaningful interactions in their life are mediated through these screens and these apps, in which they're discarnated, in which they're not being and expressing themselves fully as embodied incarnate human beings. If you want that for your child, if you want to spare them from that transhuman fate, it's asymmetrical warfare. It's you versus Silicon Valley. So that's one reason, I have a whole chapter where I go through these questions as political issues, and I examine how they've been sort of processed through American politics in recent years. And one of the things I really come out strongly for is states and, potentially federally allowing some kind of age restriction on social media or on smartphone use altogether. I think it would be incredible if we could just ban anyone under 16 from using a smartphone, the same way we would ban them from smoking cigarettes.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really is. I mean, it's becoming more common now to go out to a restaurant and look at the table next to you, and there's some 12-year-old kid out to dinner with his parents, and he has headphones on and is staring at an iPad,
Yeah.
and their brain is just melting. We're just turning these kids into like little iPad blobs that can't even function. Or you see this I saw this recently traveling in an airport, in which it's a lot of times it's literally like getting someone addicted to cocaine
Mm-hmm.
and then holding their cocaine back to get them to behave and do certain things, right? So it's like the kid misbehaves, they take the iPad away, and the response is that of an addict, right? It's just like a manic breakdown. It's like, okay, well, you have to do X, Y, and Z, or I'm not giving this thing back to you. And like, what is that doing to our human nature? What does that do to the brain to have that constant rewiring in it? And it's just simply become ubiquitous in our culture. And I like what you say about the realism. In my family, like, we've tried, it is asymmetrical warfare, but like we're in the rural areas. My kids are playing outside. They go fishing. We have ponds. We've got chickens that they take care of and ducks and things that are just real. Like go, and I liked what you said earlier is like, particularly children, like are their memories that they're making mainly predicated upon like artificialities, like digital things, or on things that are real, right? Are they remembering family dinner with their parents or grandparents? Are they going out on walks at night, right, or in the evenings? When's the last time they actually went out and just played outside? I mean, these are things that are really simple. They're simple, but it's not always easy. I mean, even myself, right? Sometimes I want to come home and collapse and just doom scroll on
Mm-hmm.
X, right? My brain is done for the day, but then they just sit there and watch me do that. So it is asymmetrical, and I appreciate you saying
And
that. But
there's
for the
a
parents out there,
really, I think, misguided libertarian, impulse that I delve into a little bit in the book, of this idea of, oh, well, the state shouldn't think it's a better parent than you. And as a general principle, sure, that's fine. But in this case, I think that, with the mismatch that we're seeing, I think families can use all the help they can get. And I think that one totally valid use of state power is to position itself to shield families from the predations of the market, to which comes back to the question of what the purpose of our political order is. Is it to protect a particular vision of human flourishing, or is it simply to maximize individual autonomy? Um,
Yeah. I mean, one thing there too is, I mean, even from like a common good example, because I agree with you that a very atomized understanding of our anthropology is not sufficient to push back against this type of predation. So, I mean, one way you look at it is like, what kind of citizens are we raising, right? If these people get up and can't function, like these are the people that you want on juries. These are the people that you want voting on things about laws and things like that that are easily manipulated through technologies and are addicted and have an attention span that's not more than what now? 30 seconds, 15 seconds, 10 seconds, it just keeps going down, right? I mean, we can't read a book anymore. I mean, in the church, sometimes we talk to parents and it's like you put these kids in front of these iPads or these video games all day long, all the time to get them to behave, and then you take them to mass and it's an hour of sitting and listening. And the things are very real around you, right? It engages all the senses. There's incense, there's all these things to bring you in. But if your brain is just simply melted, like how are they supposed to function? Like how are you setting them up to success to actually engage, not only in the natural, but the supernatural that's there when the brain itself can't even function? Like how is that? I mean, because you point out obviously that you don't hide your faith in the book. So maybe like one argument is that if you allow these things to, transhumanize you and really start to create a certain level of privation in your nature, then how disposed is your nature to grace? How disposed is your nature to actually receiving the grace that God has for you if you actually kind of smother it?
yeah, I mean, that's sort of a thorny question that I come to at the end of the book, is like, I don't know that I'm sort of enough of a Thomist or whatever to really answer this. But if you take Athanasius's formulation seriously, God became man that man might become God, that Christ effects this change in human nature, um, uh, and that by grace we can become what he is by nature. Then it really raises the question of, like, Christ did not come to save gorillas or cheetahs or watermelons or anything else in the way that he saved humanity, because he became human. He didn't become any of those other things. So if you make yourself no longer human, I think there is very much a risk of placing yourself outside of the category of being which Christ's incarnation, death, resurrection, and ascension actually redeems and brings to salvation. I have no idea where that line would be drawn. I mean, obviously, I don't. I hope that having a smartphone doesn't do it for me, but doesn't put me outside of grace. But I think you have to acknowledge that if you take the incarnation seriously, and kind of the theology around the idea of theosis seriously, you have to acknowledge that there's a point at which maybe you could place yourself outside of humanity.
Yeah, well, there's interesting concept in Christianity with sanctification, theosis, etc., that as we become closer to God, we become more ourselves. And this is not always the true in religions, right? There's a lot of religions that the more you draw close, you ascend to the divine, there's an emptying of yourself. You
Mm-hmm.
become less yourself, and the particular kind of gets absorbed or absolved and melted into the divine. Christianity is unique insofar as that we actually teach that no, right? The more that Grayson Quay draws towards Jesus Christ, the more that Grayson becomes Grayson, right? It's more of who you are. So no, the more then that you would um, engage in acts that would actually, harm your nature and your capacity, you're actually becoming less of yourself, becoming less of a human, but also less of yourself, and damaging your capacity then to be open to God's grace. I mean, these things like reality, whether we like it or not, right? Reality is this dance between nature and grace. And some of these things that I think we think are very mundane, whether it's just my phone or social media or etc., we do have to realize in a lot of ways they do make us deaf to the divine, right? They do make us deaf to the divine. It's difficult then to hear that still quiet voice
Yeah.
calling us to become more ourselves if we're constantly in this like really loud environment that's constantly entertaining our brain.
Well, I
And
love
I,
what you
I
said
want to,
about. Sorry, can I jump in there? I love what you said about being more yourself, because I think there is this like perpetually adolescent quest for identity and authenticity that we have today, and that we're going in precisely the wrong direction with that. In light of that idea, but I think that's another thing that is so frightening about the growth of these transhumanist technologies, is that they take an idea that was already there, or a cultural tendency that was already there, and they just turbocharge it. Now they can sell you, they can sell you a new shirt or new glasses frames or a new haircut. That they'll be able to sell you a new face or a new personality. There's a yeah, there's a sci-fi novel I quote in the book that's really good. I quote a lot of science fiction novels, and this just like gave me an excuse to really nerd out. But there's one I quoted called Blind Sight. I think it's from 2006. That's very good. But there's a sorry, let me say, there's a thing you can get where you can get kind of neurological tweaks in the book, in your brain, that just alter your personality or your tastes in some way. And people who are in romantic relationships just spend all their time nagging each other to get tweaks, where it's like, you don't like the same movies. Okay, just go get a tweak so you like these movies, and then we can watch them together. Okay. Like, it's just a really nightmarish thing.
yeah, there seems to be a very unholy trinity between our modern anthropology that is focused so much on this like Luciferian autonomy, and then you have technology, and the technology we have now, which seems to then kind of make real these kind of nightmare understandings of who we are as a person, right? We can actually kind of give flesh to some of these just depraved understandings of humanity. And then the third one is capitalism, that you commodify these things and package them and sell them to vulnerable people. And it's again, like you said, that asymmetrical warfare, pushing back against this has to be intentional. You have to be intentional to push back against this. But one of the things that you mentioned kind of towards the end of your introduction that I thought was fascinating, that I did not know, is that this term to transhumanize, right? This transhumanism, this transhumanize, is not actually a new word. Can you talk a little bit about like where this word first pops up?
Yeah, this is so cool. So I'll start with kind of the modern definition and then go back to the old one. But so it's first used in its modern definition by Julian Huxley, who was he wrote this essay in 1957 just called Transhumanism. He was head of the British Eugenics Society, which gives you a sense of where this movement was from the very beginning. Julian Huxley, interestingly, is the brother of Aldous Huxley, who writes Brave New World in the 1930s, which is this incredible statement of what a transhuman world would look like. And I think, in the character of John the Savage, gives you this idea of someone who is outside of that transhuman world and literally lives on a reservation, and people come and gawk at him because he's just sort of this stubborn mere human. But yeah, as I was researching this, I find out it's much older. It shows up in Dante's Paradiso. Um, the line in which it appears is "Trasumanar significar beber spaghetti ravioli." That's how my wife talks. She's Italian, but to transumanar significar beber, right? To symbolize the idea of being transhumanized in words failed me. Like I was unable to express what it meant. Dante is saying to be transhumanized, and then that really got me thinking: is that what we have essentially is a conflict between two rival transhumanisms, um, because Satan wasn't lying per se when he said you'll be like gods, because um, that was God's plan for us all along. Sons of the resurrection are equal to the angels, right? This was always the plan for us. The question was, do we sort of conform ourselves to our proper end? Do we sort of conform to an existing standard of what humanity is called to be and was made to be, or do we try to and sort of ascend to our destiny in that way, or do we try to seize it for ourselves and on our own terms? And I think that's what's happening now with transhumanism, uh, and I think that's, goes all the way back to the garden, and that's why I think this temptation is really a continuation of the original temptation that's always faced the human race. I think Satan was the first transhumanist.
I really like the picture of these two competitive kind of like transhumanizing forces, right? There's this demonic and there's this divine, both which are actually pulling on this human nature. One is a perfection of it, a completion of it, if you will, if you want to use those terms. And the other one is a warping of it, some type of disordered, right? Now, I like that a lot. And yeah, I thought that was fascinating when I was reading your book. And again, your book is kind of a tour de force of great books and great authors. And so when Dante popped up, I paid attention. It's like, oh wow, really? That term's there, and that's just fascinating about how he's using it. So I appreciate you putting that in there. Kind of like as a last thought, Grayson. Like, what do you really hope people get out of your book? Like, what would you really want people to take away when they read it?
I want people to, I think I say this in my acknowledgement section at the very end. I want people to come away with this idea of transhumanism as a lens that they can apply to, the technologies that they encounter, as we're, in this era of constant, rapid technological development, of the choices that they face, in really, foundational life situations, like starting a family or like navigating end of life care for a loved one. And thinking about voting and their purchasing and the decisions they make with money, and in the way that they're choosing to worship and to kind of what to pray for and how to look at the sort of spiritual landscape around them. I think that in all of these areas, thinking in terms of transhumanism can be really helpful. Thinking in terms of like, okay, is this particular use of this technology or this particular instance of something else an example of trying to substitute some other telos for humanity, of trying to just sort of impose my will in this situation using technology, and to sort of limitlessly expand my desires and fulfill them for myself? Or is this an opportunity where I can think like, okay, who am I? What is my telos? What is my purpose? And how, what would be the virtuous thing to do in accord with that? How would I use this technology? Would I use it at all?
Yeah, you've got to name the demon before you exercise it, right? I think your I think your book does a really good job of starting to actually help people articulate a problem, right? So it's hard to actually solve a problem if we can't actually articulate it. So we can actually kind of map it, we can articulate it, we can look at how it's affecting every area of our life, maybe in ways that we don't really expect. Maybe we think we're kind of shielded from these things, but if we self-reflect, we realize things are making claims on us as well. And even like, are we the people that we're charged with, like a father over his family? Like, are we helping to save our families, right, from these kind of influences that can really creep in and seem mundane at times? So I think you've given us a very challenging work. Again, I think you're a wonderful writer. I think reading your text is like being introduced to an entire library of great books. Obviously, on this podcast, we very much applaud that and appreciate that. So where can people pick up the book and also find out more about you?
I want to say I'm very flattered by that. I remember I've had that thought about some other books I've read, where I'm like, wow, if I just read every book you mentioned, I would have an excellent education here. But yeah, so my book's available at the Sophia Institute Press website. I would prefer you buy it there because I get more royalties that way. But if you'd like, you could also buy it at Barnes and Noble's website or on Amazon. An audiobook's also available. If you hate my voice, don't worry, I didn't narrate it. I very much asked not to do that. And yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Hemingquay, Hemingquay. and that's sort of my most active social media there. And then, I write for different websites now and then, but best way to find me there is just to Google my name. Thankfully, I have a very unique name, so most of the results that come up are actually me.
Yeah, no, we've talked about that before. I think you sound like the character in a British novel. You have a great name. You rival. I have another friend. She's popular online. She's been on the podcast. Tish Oxenrider, who I also think needs to be a character in a British novel. You guys just have excellent, excellent names. So again, Grayson, thank you so much for joining us today and telling us about your book.
Thank you for having me, Deacon.
All right, everyone. Again, that is The Transhumanist Temptation: How Technology and Ideology Are Reshaping Humanity and How to Resist. Go buy it at Sophia Press. And then next week, guys, if you want to be able to grow up and be like Grayson and write wonderful books that are entrenched in the great books themselves, then you need to read them. So next week, we actually kick off our studies on Plato with an introduction episode, and then we'll have 2 episodes on the dialogue First Alcibiades, a somewhat neglected, forgotten dialogue, but actually it was the traditional first dialogue students of Plato would read, a dialogue centered on the principle of know thyself. So check out our website for our reading schedule, and we want you to join us, and we will see you next week. Thank you.